On Wednesday, former President Trump joined Texas Governor Greg Abbott at the U.S. Mexico border, where Abbott plans to take care of Trump's unfinished business and build the wall. The pair used the event to tout Trump's handling of the border, criticize Biden's border policies, which Abbott called disastrous, and in usual and eerily familiar Trumpian form, stoke fears about migrants entering the country. Joining me now to help us make sense of it all and discuss the Biden administration efforts to unwind Trump's immigration legacy is NBC and MSNBC correspondent and author of Separated: Inside an American Tragedy, Jacob Soboroff. Jacob, welcome to the pod.
Dan, thanks for having me. Longtime fan of the pod.
Well, it's great to have you here. We've been trying to get this done for a long time, so we're excited about it. Let's start with Trump and Abbott's visit to the border yesterday. Trump said a lot of things while he was there. It's according to his account and Abbott's account, somehow the border went from one of the most secure places in the world to some sort of dystopian hellscape just in the 6 months of the Biden administration. Help us separate fact from fiction about what is really going on at the border right now.
Well, what I can tell you is what's not going on at the border, because I can tell you what I've seen based in my own experience. And when you talk about a dystopian hellscape, the thing that comes to mind for me is what I saw with my own eyes, the separation of 5,500 children deliberately by Donald Trump and his administration as a matter of deterrence in order to scare people away from coming to this country. Physicians for Human Rights called it torture. They won a Nobel Peace Prize. The American Academy of Pediatrics called it government-sanctioned child abuse. And that is a policy that was uniquely Trumpian. It had never been done before. It has not been done since. And that really, I think, is what Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, and their allies, Mark Morgan, Chad Wolf, who were all down there with him this week, want to return to, if not explicitly family separations. And I write about in the book that he did want to return to family separations after they put that policy into place and then had to pull it back because of the outrage. Other restrictive policies that hurt people in order to prevent them from coming to the United States. And the bottom line is, whatever it is they want to do, no matter how hard they want to damage people, it never works. It didn't work during the Clinton. I mean, deterrence has been the policy de facto of the U.S. government for decades. It didn't work during the Clinton administration, didn't work under the Bush administration, didn't work under the Obama administration. And Donald Trump did probably the most heinous thing to migrants crossing the southwest border in the history of the United States and ripping them apart deliberately, children and parents, and still people are coming. And so what happened down there? Basically, it was like a greatest hits medley for them, a wish list to return to, basically what the Biden administration has tried to move away from.
I mean, it was a very surreal event because, as you point out, there were Chad Wolf, Morgan, these former members of government doing what was a sort of an official government visit with an actual sitting governor is unusual. Have you ever seen anything like that before?
No, and I was an advance guy before I was a journalist. I was an advance guy to Mike Bloomberg when I was in college. And it was very clear to me just looking at the images, even down to the name placards that were on the desk. They wanted this to look like a presidential visit. It was kind of sad, honestly, in my opinion. If you ask me, it was like they were longing for a time when they were the ones, and they were the ones only, who could have that cruel posture towards migrants. And they almost were pretending that it was still their turn, their responsibility. And obviously Governor Abbott is the sitting governor, and he's tried to complete this border wall, which, Republicans and Democrats along the southwest border will tell you is not necessary to control migration into the United States. It was bizarre. I mean, I don't know. What did you think when you saw it? To me, it just struck me as former politicians, including Chad Wolf, who in the book, you'll see that he very explicitly was one of the first people to propose the separation policy to the Trump administration. It was like they were getting the band back together. They were sad that they weren't able to do all these things that they had done before. And it was like it was almost like cosplay in a weird way.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard in my mind to separate those images from the reports that Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota, a very public and presidential aspirant in 2024, if Trump doesn't run, I assume, sent the South Dakota National Guard down to the border, but it was paid for by a rich Republican donor. And it's just like we sort of have private armies and former presidents. It is this very strange alternative reality where Republicans have sort of, not that there aren't very incredibly serious issues, but they've created an alternative version of what's happening and then gone about trying to solve that problem in sort of very real and dangerous ways. you know, Biden made President Biden made undoing a lot of Trump's immigration policies and border policies specifically a big part of his campaign agenda. You know, based on your reporting, where has he succeeded and what more work does he need to do to meet those promises?
Well, look, the truth of the matter is I think that they have a really long way to go, but they've come in, according to advocates, with the right messaging, the right rhetoric. It's been lofty. They say they want to create a fair, safe, humane, orderly immigration system, and they really do want a departure from these decades of a deterrence-based approach. The approach that says if we scare people, if we tell them don't come, and every president has done that in the modern history of the United States, that they won't. And we know that that doesn't work. So I think what the Biden administration is trying to do, and for sure the Obama administration, as you know, attempted to tackle the root causes of migration. President Biden himself as VP sort of spearheaded that effort. And I think that they're trying to sort of supercharge that, take that and make that the guiding force for the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. But it's not easy. It's not easy because these facilities that Donald Trump was able to put children in along the border were there before. I mean, the McAllen Border Patrol Processing Station was stood up where the cages were during the Obama administration. The ICE family detention centers were open during the Obama administration. I mean, these are institutional, systemic issues that you cannot undo like this. And in fact, the only reason Donald Trump was able to separate children so easily is because the apparatus, the infrastructure of punishment in our immigration system existed in that way for a long time, endorsed by Republicans and Democrats. So if the Biden administration is successful in undoing all of that, I think it would be a significant departure. They've already tried to get more families out of detention. They're trying not to hold people as long when they come into the United States. They're trying to get children out of those Border Patrol stations and into Health and Human Services as fast as possible. But this is not I don't think it's a months-long project. I don't even think it's a one-term project. If they're going to do what they say they're going to do, it's going to take a very long time. And it's not only the root causes, it's not only addressing poverty, malnutrition, starvation, climate change, persecution. It's also changing the approach to how migrants are dealt with when they come to seek asylum at the southwest border, because if they don't change it, and Secretary Mayorkas has said to me directly, face-to-face, he would like a different approach. He doesn't want to lock up families. He doesn't want kids languishing over the 72-hour limit. If they don't do that, there'll be another increase in migration at some point, and you're going to see this all play out again. The same thing we saw several times, during the Obama administration, what we saw during the Trump administration, and what we saw here at the beginning of this administration as well.
You cover the immigration advocacy community very closely. What are some of the things that they want the administration to do right now that they've not yet done or not yet been able to do for some assorted reasons?
Yeah, great question. Title 42, I think, sounds confusing when you hear it. It's like, what is that? But that's the number one agenda item for immigration advocates at the moment. What Title 42 is a Trump administration CDC policy, supposedly, that bars migrants from coming into the country based on, the idea it'll protect the U.S. from COVID. Doctors, as an aside, say it's just not true and not necessary. And the Biden administration kept it in place for the most part. They let in unaccompanied children, which the Trump administration wasn't doing. They've started to let in some families, but all single adults are immediately expelled when they get to the border. Many families are immediately expelled when they get to the border. And what that is resulting in is another form of family separation. Families are sending children ahead of mom and dad because the kids have an opportunity to get into the United States. And it is putting people, if you ask organizations like Human Rights First, who documents this stuff almost on a daily basis, into extremely dangerous conditions when the public health professionals would tell you, we actually don't need this as a public health imperative. It's really more about politics at this point. And that's sort of it's not even a secret anymore, I guess is what I'm trying to say, at the White House level. They're gearing up to try to undo this policy, but it's not happening fast enough.
And why do you think it's moving more slow? I know in the beginning of the administration, I talked to Dara Lind, who was reporting on what was happening on the border. And one of the biggest issues was COVID. It made everything harder about how many people you could put in a facility. It was causing them to be in some of these satellite facilities that were, even worse condition than the permanent facilities. Is that still an issue that's slowing things down? Is it the simple fact that government just takes longer than it should? Are there issues still? One of the things we experienced in the Obama administration was even when you had a shift in policy at the top, getting sort of the line officers,
the operators.
ICE,
yeah, that's right.
The operators to do that. What are sort of the challenges they're dealing with here?
Well, Title 42 is separate and distinct, I think, from capacity issues in Health and Human Services. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think nobody wants these children to be in, once they get to the custody of HHS, which is where advocates want them to be, nobody wants them to be in what are called emergency intake sites, like the one that's at Fort Bliss, for instance. There were these horrific reports in court documents that came out, just over the last couple of weeks about kids having suicidal ideations and other really terrible stuff because of the conditions there, because of the scale, because of the types of personnel that are there. They're not licensed facilities. And those licensed facilities, to your point, have limited capacity because of COVID. They can't put kids side by side in beds, almost like in a dormitory style setting. And that's real. That's very real. And I was actually on a press call with Secretary Becerra the other day where they said they're trying to wind down those emergency sites that are less personal, that advocates say are more dangerous to children, and move to a licensed bed type model. It's not as relevant with Title 42 on the border. The idea that COVID is running rampant is just obviously not the case. You see the president and the vice president and everybody going around the country not wearing masks anymore. I'm sure you and I, when we go out, into the public, are not wearing masks anymore, unless it's a situation where you need to. And so when it comes to that, Title 42 on the border, I don't think COVID is an excuse at this point. That's what doctors are saying. Don't take my word for it. Take the professionals' word for it. But when it comes to how we're going to house kids, I do think that it's still an impediment because obviously kids aren't vaccinated.
There's been a lot of blowback among some of the immigration advocacy community over the statements about "don't come" that were made during the vice president's trip to Central America. At the same time, there was a report in Slate yesterday that said the president is working to make America's asylum system more humane while preventing anyone from reaching it. Yeah. Can you help sort of unpack sort of both the imperative behind why people are delivering this "don't come" message, what they're trying to say, and the challenges with the asylum system right now?
To be honest with you, I think "don't come," based on my reporting and based on my observations, is a fruitless message. It just doesn't work. You might remember the interview that President Obama did with George Stephanopoulos, where he very famously said, these kids should not come, right? And it circulated on social media, I think, during the Trump administration, saying, look, this is not a new message. Trump sent the strongest "don't come" message possible. We will rip you away from your children and leave you with personal and lifelong trauma that you will never be able to undo and will have to endure for as long as you walk this earth. And people still came. The numbers at the end of his administration were as high as they had been in the modern era. They went down with COVID, and now they're back up. And that's another thing that I'd like to sort of do a reality check on, is that everybody's talking about how the numbers today are as high as they've been in 20 years. They're not much different from the numbers at the peak of the Trump administration. And the only reason those numbers went down were not because of the cruelty. They were because of COVID. They were because people stayed home. People had no other option but to stay home. Now they have no other option but to leave the desperate circumstances that they are in. So Vice President Harris can say "don't come." Donald Trump can say "don't come" with extreme cruelty. President Obama can say "don't come." It does not work. It has never worked. And asylum, so the other part of this is protected under international law and is an international right that people have. And so you can say "don't come" all you want, but you're basically asking people not to exercise their right to step foot into the United States and say, look, I'm seeking a refuge, basically. I'm seeking safety and security from any number of issues. And I just don't think those two things are compatible. The "don't come" message with "we're the United States of America. We are a place that represents safety, security, and a better life. And we will protect you once you make it to our not our shores, but the southwest border."
I mean, in my time in the White House, there was no issue that I found more challenging to deal with. And this for all the reasons you say, right? You can send a message, you can do these things. The laws are so complicated, confusing. You end up with these unaccompanied children with not an obvious solution what to do with them in a way
Correct.
that is safe and healthy. And you have, in some cases, the wrong agency in charge of it. But I think part of the challenge in the interpretation of the "don't come" message, and there's obviously some real issues that have to be dealt with the asylum process itself in this, in the transition from Trump to Biden and the post-COVID and the transition from COVID to theoretically post-COVID world. But isn't some of the message, there are other ways to exercise your right to asylum than going on this very, very dangerous journey that involves, in many cases, trafficking. I mean, some of the stories that you have written and others have talked about that have happened to children and women on these paths are, just absolutely horrifying.
The Central American Minors Program, which is the official name of basically the way to apply to get to the United States from your home country, was literally dismantled by the Trump administration. It was stood up when you guys were around. And now the Biden administration is trying to bring it back and scale it up. But the scale of people who are able to actually go through that process and come here, pales in comparison to the amount of people that show up on the southwest border. And you're right. I guess the question is, how do you prevent people from having to go on this dangerous journey? One of the most dangerous journeys on planet Earth. President Trump called it a walk in Central Park, or like a walk in Central Park. I never heard something more ridiculous. In the first place, how do you do it? And I don't think that there is an answer at this point, and that's part of the challenge of this. One of the things that happens during every administration as well is that they start leaning on Mexico and leaning on the Central American countries to prevent people from coming here. And I guess the question that I have is for the Biden administration, or for anyone else that wants to reform this, what part of having Mexico outsourcing enforcement, I guess, is the sort of the shorthand. What part of outsourcing enforcement, telling people to turn around and just wait it out in your home country, is building a fairer, safer, humane system? Just because we don't do the deporting or expelling doesn't mean that Mexico doing it is not equally as harmful to some of these families. And, you just can't tell families who... I went to Chiquimula and Zacapa when I was reporting the book in Guatemala, the dry corridor where people's livelihoods are literally drying up because of, climate change, climate variability, things like El Nino. They're not able to make money from other crops that they can go work on in the fields. There's no supplemental nutrition. And what happens then is you're either faced with a situation where you're going to stay at home or you're going to leave for survival. And that's what I found over and over again when I went to sort of those rural communities, is that people didn't have any choice. There is not a single person that I met when I was there. I heard the vice president say this too, who will tell you, yeah, I want to leave. I definitely want to leave, and I want to take that journey across Mexico in order to make my way to the United States. It just doesn't happen. Almost nobody will tell you that. But when faced with that choice, that is what they do. And so until, they use the language about capacity, Secretary Mayorkas, the vice president, until they can figure out a way to build capacity and actually have these systems work in country in order to get people to apply and leave by airplane in order to come here rather than take the journey, you're going to still see the same thing. And this is why I'm a journalist and not a policymaker. I actually don't know what that looks like, but it is perhaps, I think, the greatest challenge in creating the system that they say that they want to create.
In the context of trying to unwind the Trump immigration policies, one of the absolute highest priorities is trying to reunite the children who are separated with their families. You reported yesterday that lawyers and outreach workers have found the parents of 23 more migrant children. That brings the number of separated children to 368. What are the prospects for reuniting the remaining children, and what sort of efforts are underway to do that?
I think it's sort of a zero fail, to use the title of Carol Lenig's book, project for this administration. I think that they're not going to stop. At least that's what they tell me, until they're able to track down and find each and every one of them. It's actually higher than the 368. The 368 is just those who they have not been able to reach yet. They can't find them. They literally can't find them because of how horrible the record keeping was during the Trump administration. There's over 1,000 families who are still separated, many of them parents that were deported right after they were taken from their kids. So they've been separated for years, 3 years, many in this, at this point, maybe some of them maybe for 4 years. And so you've got, and I've embedded with some of these folks, you got people going door to door in the United States looking for families who they cannot track down. You've got families in Central America. There are NGOs like Justice in Motion, Kids in Need of Defense, the Women's Refugee Commission, Al Otro Lado, Seneca family of agencies. They are, and the president said this too, that they're sleuths, they're detectives. They have to go and basically go through every piece of data that they can find. It was purposely done this way, I should say, and we should say it over and over again by the Trump administration. And it's why I wonder, actually, I mean, there's the reunification piece of this, and then there's the accountability piece of this. And my question is, President Biden said as a candidate, he believed this policy was criminal. He told Jeff Bennett, my colleague, that the thorough investigation was going to happen from the Justice Department about criminality of this policy. I believe that the U.S. government can entirely, working with these NGO partners, find and track down and reunite these families, and hopefully give them permanent status in the United States. That's something that hasn't been guaranteed yet. The other question I have is, what happens to the people we were talking about earlier? What happens to Chad Wolf, Kirstjen Nielsen, Jeff Sessions, Stephen Miller, President Trump himself? They had I read about this in the New Afterword of the paperback. They had a meeting in the White House Situation Room where they did a show of hands vote called for by Stephen Miller to move forward with separations. Think about the things when you guys were in office that the Situation Room was used for, most famously, going after Osama bin Laden. The idea that these guys were sitting there and saying, hold up your hand, it's un-American if we don't move forward with family separations. They knew full well exactly what the consequences would be because they were warned by HHS, they were warned by people in ICE, they were warned by people in DHS, all across the board, and they did it anyway. So will they reunite the families? I think if this administration does what they say they're going to do, yeah, they will. Do I think that it's happening soon enough? No, there is no soon enough for trying to heal these families that went through what they went through. But the next step is, will there be justice? And right now, I see no signs of that. And there's been no evidence, including Secretary Mayorkas in our conversations has said reunifications are first. If accountability, that will come next.
That's a lot to think about. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us. Check out his book, Separated, which is now out in paperback.
Dan, thanks.